The prince of mathematicians or an irresponsible husband? The controversy surrounding Carl Friedrich Gauss is not just about his towering genius, but also about the shadows in his private life. On one hand, he was the man who reshaped mathematics, who gave number theory its crown, who predicted the orbit of Ceres, and astonished astronomers. On the other hand, he was a husband, and father often described as distant, cold, and at times indifferent to the emotional needs of those closest to him. This tension between intellectual glory and personal shortcomings defines the story of Gauss as much as any theorem or discovery. Born in Brunswick in 1777 to a poor family, Gauss displayed genius from an age so early that it seemed almost supernatural. The famous tale of the 7-year-old who instantly solved the sum of numbers from 1 to 100 was not just a child's trick, but a revelation of a mind that saw patterns where others saw only tasks. His mother quietly nurtured his gifts, and fate intervened when the Duke of Brunswick recognized his talent and sponsored his education. At Göttingen University, Gauss discovered his destiny. He turned toward mathematics with an intensity that left even his professors speechless, proving the constructibility of the 17-sided polygon with straight edge and compass, a problem unsolved since the time of the Greeks. In 1801, his masterpiece Disquisitiones Arithmeticae announced to the world that number theory, once a playground of curiosity, was now a rigorous discipline. With quadratic reciprocity and modular arithmetic, Gauss didn't just solve problems, he redefined the very language of mathematics. But his genius did not stay confined to paper. When astronomers lost sight of the dwarf planet Ceres, Gauss used his newly invented method of least squares to calculate its orbit. His prediction was flawless, and when Ceres was rediscovered exactly where Gauss had said it would be, his reputation exploded across Europe. Yet life outside theorems was less harmonious. In 1805, Gauss married Johanna Osthoff, and for a brief time he seemed to find balance between the abstract world of numbers and the tangible warmth of family. But tragedy struck in 1809 when Johanna died in childbirth, along with their infant. Gauss was devastated. Those who knew him saw a rare crack in his usually cold exterior, but within a year he remarried Minna Waldeck, Johanna's friend. This second marriage was described as practical, dutiful, and emotionally restrained. With Minna, Gauss had more children, yet his role as husband and father became increasingly marked by distance. His children often felt overshadowed by the immense presence of their father's intellect, some eventually fleeing to the Americas in search of their own identities. Meanwhile, Gauss expanded his dominion into geodesy, measuring the Earth with unprecedented precision, and in doing so, introduced the concept of Gaussian curvature, which would one day underpin Einstein's theory of relativity. He moved seamlessly between heavens and earth, from predicting planetary motions to mapping the landscape of Hanover. His work with Wilhelm Weber in the 1,830 seconds created one of the first electromagnetic telegraphs and pioneered research in magnetism, further proving that Gauss's mind knew no boundaries. But behind these triumphs lay contradictions. He was meticulous to the point of secrecy, publishing only what he considered perfect, often discouraging students by dismissing their effort. At home, he rarely showed tenderness. One daughter, Eugenie, would remain unmarried, dedicating her life to caring for him. Others felt suffocated by his severity. Was this the price of genius? To devote oneself entirely to the pursuit of truth while neglecting the bonds of family? By the time Gauss entered his later years, he had become both a legend and a recluse. At the Göttingen Observatory, he reigned as a monarch of science, revered and feared. His discoveries in number theory, astronomy, geometry, statistics, and physics had changed the foundations of human knowledge. Yet the stories of his domestic life told of a man whose brilliance left little space for ordinary warmth. When he died in 1855, the world mourned the mathematician but wondered about the man. Gauss's life stands as a paradox. The same mind that sought harmony in numbers lived in disharmony with human emotion. Was he truly the prince of mathematicians? Undeniably. Was he also an irresponsible husband, consumed by intellect and blind to intimacy? The answer remains entangled in the silence of those who lived under his shadow. Carl Friedrich Gauss's middle years were a time of both astonishing scientific expansion and deepening personal contradictions. In the first half of the 19th century, he rose to become the unrivaled intellectual monarch of Göttingen. His name echoed through the halls of European academies, yet in his own home his children whispered resentments, and his second wife, Minna, struggled under the cold weight of a husband who lived more in abstractions than in affections. This duality is central to understanding Gauss, the man who measured the universe with unprecedented accuracy, but left his closest companions feeling immeasurably distant. At the Göttingen Observatory, where Gauss presided from 1807 until his death, the boundaries between disciplines melted under his hands. He was not just a mathematician, but an astronomer, physicist, geodesist, and statistician. His Theoria Modus Corporum Coelestium, 1809, introduced powerful mathematical tools for orbital mechanics, ensuring that astronomers could predict planetary movements with unmatched precision. The method of least squares, born out of this work, became a universal language of data analysis. It still underpins everything from modern physics experiments to machine learning algorithms today. In this way, Gauss remains alive not only in history books, but also in every data set parsed by scientists searching for patterns in noisy reality. But as Gauss was tightening the orbits of planets on paper, his own orbit as a family man was wobbling. His second wife, Minna, lacked the spark of love he had once shared with Johanna. She endured his emotional absence with resignation. For Gauss, the death of Johanna had scarred him so deeply that perhaps he chose never again to expose himself to such vulnerability. Instead, he poured his intensity into work, insulating himself from loss by surrounding his mind with certainties of calculation. His children, meanwhile, grew up in the long shadow of a father who demanded rigor in everything, yet seldom offered praise. His son Eugen, for example, clashed with him so bitterly that he eventually emigrated to America, determined to carve out an identity beyond his father's relentless expectations. The stories of these children suggest that while Gauss ruled mathematics with elegance, he ruled his household with rigidity and silence. Professionally, however, Gauss entered what could be called his imperial phase. In the 1,820 seconds and 1,830 seconds, his work in geodesy transformed the field. Surveying the Kingdom of Hanover required him not only to direct teams across fields and forests, but also to invent new mathematics to handle the Earth's curvature. His development of differential geometry, particularly the concept of Gaussian curvature, revealed how surfaces bend in space. Centuries later, Albert Einstein would rely on this foundation to describe the fabric of spacetime itself. Thus, from Gauss's triangulation of German hills emerged the mathematics of the cosmos. His partnership with Wilhelm Weber further demonstrated his versatility. Together, they investigated magnetism, laying down the mathematical framework that would later be unified by Maxwell. They even strung wires across Göttingen to build an early electromagnetic telegraph primitive by modern standards, but revolutionary in its implications. While other scientists confined themselves to one corner of knowledge, Gauss swept across domains with the same authority he had shown as a young man proving theorems in number theory. Yet for all these achievements, Gauss never shed his cautious nature. He published sparingly, revealing only the results he considered perfect. This reluctance, sometimes called the Gauss effect, left the scientific community both awed and frustrated. Many of his contemporaries advanced ideas he had already discovered privately but withheld from print. For example, Gauss explored non-Euclidean geometry long before Lobachevsky and Bolyai, but chose not to publish his insights, fearing controversy. Historians continue to debate whether this was humility, arrogance, or simple perfectionism. By the 1,840 seconds, Gauss had become a legend in his own lifetime. Universities sought his endorsement, and young scholars longed for his mentorship. But those who worked with him often found him intimidating, critical, and unsympathetic. He was known to dismiss students with a wave of his hand, declaring their work unworthy of attention. A man who demanded absolute clarity from numbers seemed unable to grant grace to human imperfections. This sharpness extended to his private life. His daughters were expected to serve his household, and one, Eugenie, never married because Gauss needed her presence. Whether this was selfishness or a father's desperate need for constancy after losing Johanna is uncertain, but the result was the same. His family bore the weight of his brilliance. As Gauss aged, his reputation solidified into myth. He became the embodiment of the phrase Prince of Mathematicians. Every new mathematician, from across Europe to the Americas, measured their work against the towering standard he had set. Yet whispers persisted in Göttingen about the stern old man who rarely smiled, who had loved once but never again with the same fire, who fathered children but gave them little warmth. When Gauss died in 1855, the world mourned not just a scientist but a symbol of intellectual supremacy. He was buried in Göttingen, his grave marked by modest simplicity despite his monumental contributions. His name endures in the Gaussian distribution, in Gauss's law of electromagnetism, in Gaussian curvature, and countless other concepts. Every scientist who encounters these terms touches, however faintly, the mind of Gauss. But those who knew him personally remembered something else, a man both brilliant and flawed, who gave everything to knowledge and perhaps too little to those who shared his home. Thus the question lingers: is Carl Friedrich Gauss to be remembered solely as the prince of mathematicians, a sovereign of reason, or must we also confront the reality that in pursuing immortality in numbers, he left behind a legacy of emotional absence? The truth, perhaps, is that he was both. His genius was undeniable, but so too was the cost it exacted from those who loved him. By the time Carl Friedrich Gauss entered the final decades of his life, he was no longer just a mathematician, he was an institution, a living monument to human intellect. His name carried weight in every academy of Europe. To say Gauss was to invoke authority, as if his word alone could resolve disputes in mathematics, astronomy, physics, or geodesy. And yet, for all his prestige, Gauss remained curiously isolated, a man who lived more in calculations than in conversation, more at ease with numbers than with people. In the 1,830 seconds and 1,840 seconds, the Göttingen Observatory became not only his workplace, but also his throne room. Here, he presided with meticulous rigor, treating every observation and every calculation as if the fate of truth itself depended on them. He was famous for refusing to compromise. If a measurement was off, if a theorem was sloppy, he would rather withhold it than release it half-finished. To Gauss, mathematics was not a career but a sacred trust, and he could not tolerate imperfection. This perfectionism, while it preserved the purity of his published works, also meant that countless insights remained locked in his notebooks, unpublished, sometimes unfinished. Among them were early explorations into non-Euclidean geometry. Gauss had realized that the parallel postulate of Euclidean geometry might not be absolute, that curved spaces could exist where new geometries thrived. But he withheld these thoughts, fearing ridicule or controversy. When Bolyai and Lobachevsky later announced their revolutionary geometries, Gauss privately admitted he had known such truths long before. Critics have since asked, was Gauss cowardly in silence, or simply wise in waiting? At the same time, his household lived under the heavy shadow of his intellect. Minna, his second wife, suffered ill health and a husband whose attention drifted elsewhere. She died in 1831, leaving Gauss widowed again. Unlike with Johanna, whose death had shattered him decades earlier, Gauss greeted Minna's passing with stoic endurance, perhaps even relief. By then he had hardened. His children, meanwhile, charted difficult paths. Some left for America, disillusioned by the impossible standard their father set. Others stayed, resigned to orbiting around his brilliance. His daughter Eugenie, in particular, devoted herself to his care, sacrificing marriage and independence. To outsiders, this might look like filial devotion. To historians, it looks like the silent cost of genius. And yet Gauss was not without tenderness. In private letters, he occasionally revealed affection, regret, even humor. But such moments were rare, eclipsed by the public image of the stern prince of mathematicians. If he was an irresponsible husband, it was not because he deliberately neglected his family, but because his mind belonged elsewhere, chasing truths that transcended daily life. His devotion to mathematics was absolute, and absolute devotion leaves little room for compromise. Meanwhile, his influence spread beyond Germany. His mathematical tools, Gaussian distributions, Gaussian curvature, Gauss's law entered the bloodstream of science. The bell curve, now ubiquitous in statistics, traces back to him. Every physicist applying Gauss's law of electromagnetism, every geometer using Gaussian curvature, every statistician invoking the normal distribution is in dialogue with him across time. Few figures have so thoroughly infused science with their fingerprint. In his final years, Gauss grew increasingly reclusive. He walked daily, often alone, calculating silently as he strolled through Göttingen's streets. Visitors described him as sharp-eyed, with a mind that seemed as active at 70 as it had been at 20. But he also carried the weight of age, the loneliness of outliving his closest companions, and the distance of children who had sought new lives abroad. His fame was universal, but his household was fractured. On the 23rd of February, 1855, Gauss died in Göttingen at the age of 77. The world mourned with solemn reverence. His funeral drew scholars, dignitaries, and admirers who spoke of him as a monarch of the mind. He was laid to rest in Göttingen Cemetery, his grave marked simply, without the grandeur one might expect for such a titan. But perhaps this was fitting. Gauss, after all, sought perfection in clarity, not ostentation. His legacy endures not only in mathematics, but in the very language of science. He gave us the Gaussian distribution, the Gaussian integer, Gauss's theorem, and the Gaussian curvature. His name became shorthand for precision, rigor, and genius. But alongside this legacy is a quieter story, the story of a man who was revered by the world, but often distant from those closest to him. A man whose pursuit of eternal truths left scars on his family. And so the question posed at the beginning remains unresolved. Was Carl Friedrich Gauss the prince of mathematicians or an irresponsible husband? History cannot answer definitively. He was both the architect of modern science and a flawed human being, luminous in intellect yet imperfect in love. His life is a reminder that genius carries a cost, and that those costs are often paid not by the genius alone, but by those around him. When Carl Friedrich Gauss died in 1855, Europe did not simply lose a scientist, it lost an icon. Newspapers from Göttingen to Paris, from London to St. Petersburg carried notices of his passing. Obituaries hailed him as the greatest mathematician since antiquity, a man whose contributions rivaled those of Archimedes and Newton. His burial in Göttingen was solemn yet modest, reflecting the duality of his existence, a man of almost incomprehensible intellectual wealth who lived with personal austerity. But in the years that followed, Gauss's reputation only grew, evolving into legend. Scientists across the 19th and 20th centuries drew upon his work as if it were scripture. Astronomers used his orbital mechanics. Physicists leaned on Gauss's law of electromagnetism. Statisticians adopted the bell curve as the emblem of probability. His influence became so vast that it was difficult to imagine modern science without his fingerprints. Every new breakthrough seemed to trace back to a theorem, a method, or an idea that Gauss had seeded decades earlier. In this sense, his genius appeared eternal, woven into the very framework of knowledge. Yet alongside the reverence arose whispers of critique. Historians and biographers began asking uncomfortable questions about Gauss the man, not just Gauss the mathematician. The more scholars examined his private life, the more they saw a pattern. A husband who remarried with astonishing speed after the death of his beloved Johanna, a father whose severity pushed children away, a patriarch who leaned on his daughters to sacrifice their own lives for his comfort. Was this simply the cultural norm of early 19th century Germany, or did Gauss's brilliance come at the expense of his humanity? In academic circles, this debate grew louder. Some argued that it was unfair to hold Gauss to modern standards of emotional sensitivity. The early 1800 seconds were an era of formality, stoicism, and rigid gender roles. Men, especially those of intellect, were not expected to be demonstrative husbands or affectionate fathers. Gauss, in this view, was a man of his time perhaps cold, but no more than countless others. What made him stand out was not his lack of tenderness, but his unparalleled mental power. Others, however, countered that even in his own age, Gauss was unusually distant. Letters from his children reveal a sense of abandonment, of living under a roof dominated by intellect but starved of warmth. The decision of some of his sons to emigrate to America was not only an act of ambition but also an escape from their father's suffocating presence. His daughter Eugenie's lifelong devotion to him may have been love, but it was also sacrifice, a life narrowed by the demands of her father's needs. In this light, Gauss seems less like a product of his time and more like a man so consumed by his pursuit of perfection that he forgot the imperfections of human hearts. Philosophers have often used Gauss as a case study in the moral ambiguities of genius. Can a person who advances civilization be judged harshly for failing in private roles? Should we separate the prince of mathematicians from the irresponsible husband, or are they inseparable facets of the same life? One school of thought insists that greatness in science absolves personal failings, that the gifts Gauss gave humanity outweigh whatever neglect his family endured. Another view insists that true greatness must include humanity, that Gauss's brilliance is diminished by the cost it exacted on those closest to him. This debate has no resolution, and perhaps that is why Gauss remains endlessly fascinating. He is not a flat portrait of genius, but a complex mosaic of brilliance and flaw, triumph and tragedy. His scientific works shine with eternal clarity, yet his personal story resists such neat resolution. It is precisely this tension that keeps his biography alive, studied, and retold. By the late 19th century, Gauss's reputation had crystallized into that of a demigod of mathematics. Statues were erected in his honor. His image adorned postage stamps and banknotes. Göttingen, once his quiet workplace, became a pilgrimage site for mathematicians. Students stood in awe at his grave, whispering his name as if invoking a saint. The legend of Gauss the genius eclipsed Gauss the man. The controversies about his family faded into the background, overshadowed by the sheer immensity of his scientific legacy. And yet, in the 20th and 21st centuries, as historians grew more interested in the human dimensions of scientists, the debate reopened. Biographers probed his correspondence, his diaries, and the recollections of his children. What emerged was a portrait not of a monster, but of a man whose extraordinary gifts created extraordinary distance. His life forces us to confront an enduring truth, that genius can illuminate the universe while casting shadows at home. In the end, Gauss occupies both roles simultaneously: the prince of mathematicians, whose discoveries underpin modern science, and the flawed human being who struggled, sometimes unsuccessfully, to fulfill the ordinary duties of love and fatherhood. His story is not a simple tale of triumph, but a layered narrative of brilliance and burden. To study Gauss is to confront the price of genius, a price paid not only by the genius himself, but by those who lived in his orbit. Long after his death in 1855, Gauss's influence did not fade. It expanded. His discoveries became foundations, his methods became tools, and his name became a permanent fixture in the vocabulary of science. Few figures in history have so thoroughly transcended their era. Where others contributed to a field, Gauss seemed to create entire landscapes of knowledge. In physics, James Clerk Maxwell drew upon Gauss's insights into magnetism and electricity when formulating his unified electromagnetic theory in the 1,860 seconds. Gauss's law, stating the relationship between electric charge and electric flux, became one of the four Maxwell equations, pillars of modern physics. Without Gauss, the path to understanding light as an electromagnetic wave might have been delayed by decades. In geometry, Albert Einstein leaned on the concept of Gaussian curvature to articulate the theory of general relativity. The bending of spacetime, which explained gravity in an entirely new way, was mathematically possible only because Gauss had already laid the groundwork for understanding curved surfaces. Every time physicists describe the curvature of spacetime, they are invoking Gauss's ghost. In statistics, Gauss's name became synonymous with probability itself. The Gaussian distribution, or bell curve, governs not only test scores and human heights, but also random noise in electrical systems, fluctuations in stock markets, and even errors in quantum experiments. The normal distribution is so central that to call it Gaussian is both a tribute and a recognition. It was Gauss who gave the modern world a way to interpret randomness. His method of least squares, likewise, is embedded in every regression model, every forecast, every scientific attempt to pull a signal out of noise. From astronomers tracking exoplanets to engineers designing bridges, Gauss's methods pulse at the heart of certainty. Thus, Gauss's afterlife is everywhere. He lives in physics, laboratories, in financial analyses, in computer algorithms, in the mathematics of artificial intelligence. His hand guides the orbit of satellites, the mapping of GPS, and the decoding of genomes. Even those who have never heard his name benefit from his silent presence. This ubiquity has earned him the nickname the mathematician of the modern world, even though he lived and died in the 18th and 19th centuries. But as his intellectual empire expanded posthumously, the questions about his personal life persisted in the margins. Did Gauss sacrifice his family's happiness for the sake of universal truth? Some historians defend him, noting that grief from Johanna's death left him emotionally scarred, and that his second marriage, though colder, was more a matter of survival than neglect. Others suggest that Gauss's relentless perfectionism, which made him a titan in science, also made him incapable of compromise in relationships. He demanded absolute clarity from mathematics and, consciously or not, from people. Those who could not meet his impossible standard, including his own children, were left feeling dismissed or abandoned. And yet, it is perhaps unfair to reduce Gauss to this dichotomy. He was neither simply a prince nor merely an irresponsible husband. He was a human being caught in the paradox of genius, gifted with an intellect so vast it dwarfed ordinary concerns, yet bound by the same mortal ties of love, loss, and duty. The very tension between these two roles is what makes his story resonate beyond equations. Gauss's reputation in the 20th century became a mirror for society's changing attitudes toward genius. In an age that idolized intellect, he was celebrated without question. In an age more concerned with the humanity of scientists, he was scrutinized. Each generation sees in Gauss what it values most: precision, rigor, creativity, or, alternatively, compassion and balance. The enduring debate over his life is itself a testament to his magnitude. Only a figure of immense consequence can be so endlessly reinterpreted. Today, Gauss's myth is sustained not only by academics, but also by culture. Statues of him stand in Brunswick and Göttingen. His portrait appears on stamps and coins. Universities name institutes in his honor. He is quoted in textbooks as if he were a sage, invoked in classrooms as if he were still lecturing. To many, he embodies the ideal of mathematics itself, pure, logical, eternal. And yet, behind every monument is the man who once grieved over Johanna, who once alienated his children, who once walked alone through Göttingen with calculations swirling in his mind. This dual legacy of immortal genius and flawed humanity makes Gauss more than a historical figure. He becomes a symbol of the eternal question: can one pursue truth absolutely without paying a price in human intimacy? For Gauss, the answer may have been yes, but his family bore the consequences. For the world, however, the reward was incalculable. The language of science itself, sharpened, clarified, perfected. And so, the myth of Gauss continues to grow. Every time a student sketches a bell curve, every time a physicist writes down Gauss's law, every time a geometer bends a surface in thought, they keep him alive. The Prince of Mathematicians walks silently among us, not as a man of flesh and flaw, but as a mind immortalized in the structures of knowledge. If Gauss's lifetime achievements established him as the Prince of Mathematicians, it was the generations after his death that turned him into something more: a myth, a cultural symbol, a shorthand for human brilliance. To this day, no student can traverse the landscape of mathematics without crossing paths with his name. Gauss is not just studied, he is invoked, admired, and sometimes feared. And in this continued remembrance, the tension of his life, the towering intellect versus the distant family man, remains unresolved. In classrooms around the world, the story of the boy who summed the numbers from 1 to 100 inches seconds is often the first introduction students have to Gauss. It is a story polished by time, repeated so often that it has become part of mathematical folklore. Teachers tell it not only to inspire, but to illustrate what it means to see differently. Where others plod step by step, Gauss leapt straight to the elegant pattern. For many children, this anecdote becomes a first encounter with the idea that mathematics is not mere calculation, but insight, intuition, even artistry. Thus, Gauss lives in education not as a stern old man, but as a mischievous prodigy who outsmarted his teacher. Yet, as students grow older and advance into university mathematics, Gauss reappears in more daunting forms. His Disquisitiones Arithmeticae is still studied, though it is not light reading. His theories in number theory, his methods in statistics, his theorems in geometry, his laws in physics, all of them reemerge, each time deepening his presence. In this way, education perpetuates the Gauss myth. He is everywhere, at every stage, a constant reminder that one mind can shape entire disciplines. Outside of education, Gauss has seeped into culture. Statues and monuments celebrate him as Germany's scientific crown jewel. His portrait once appeared on the German 10-mark note, a recognition not just of his scientific value, but of his symbolic worth as a national icon. Stamps, coins, even craters on the moon carry his name. To the public, Gauss is not simply a mathematician. He is a figure of cultural pride, a demonstration that human genius can rise from humble beginnings to alter the trajectory of civilization. But alongside this adoration, modern culture has begun to explore the more complicated sides of Gauss. Biographers probe his letters to reveal a man torn between passion and stoicism, genius and grief. Documentaries linger on the tragedies of his family life, the rapid remarriage after Johanna's death, the alienation of his children. In doing so, they offer not a sanitized saint, but a flawed human being. This balance between reverence and realism is what keeps Gauss relevant not only to mathematicians, but also to philosophers, historians, and ordinary readers seeking to understand the price of greatness. Philosophers, in particular, find in Gauss a case study for perennial questions. What does it mean to be a genius? Is genius a blessing or a burden? Does society excuse personal failings because of intellectual contributions, and should it? Gauss forces us to wrestle with these dilemmas. His genius is undeniable, yet so is the pain felt by those around him. To celebrate him without acknowledging this pain is dishonest. To condemn him without acknowledging his contributions is equally so. Some thinkers argue that Gauss represents the archetype of the inhuman genius, a figure so consumed by the pursuit of truth that ordinary responsibilities fall away. Others counter that this is a romanticization, that Gauss was not incapable of love, but simply scarred by grief and constrained by the norms of his time. The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere in between. Gauss was a man of immense intellect, who made choices some admirable, some regrettable, that shaped both his legacy and his family's fate. In this philosophical reflection, Gauss becomes more than a mathematician. He becomes a mirror in which society examines its own values. Do we admire brilliance at any cost, or do we demand a balance between intellect and empathy? Do we place statues only for theorems, or do we weigh the private lives behind them? The continued debate over Gauss shows that his story transcends mathematics. It is a story about the human condition itself, the limits of devotion, the costs of obsession, the tension between immortality in ideas and mortality in relationships. Thus, Gauss lives on not only in equations and monuments, but also in the questions we ask about genius. He is remembered not only for what he discovered, but for what he forces us to confront, that the pursuit of eternal truths can illuminate the universe even as it casts shadows at home. In this way, the Prince of Mathematicians remains forever controversial, forever inspiring, forever unresolved. If Gauss could somehow awaken in the 21st century, he would find himself everywhere. His fingerprints are embedded not only in the blackboards of classrooms, but also in satellites orbiting the Earth, in algorithms crunching numbers, in artificial intelligence predicting patterns, and in physicists bending the fabric of space-time. He would be startled not because his ideas are forgotten, but because they are so commonplace that humanity often forgets they were his. In a sense, Gauss has become invisible not because he is absent, but because he is omnipresent. Albert Einstein himself acknowledged the debt to Gauss. The general theory of relativity, which explained gravity as the curvature of space-time, could not have been articulated without the groundwork laid in differential geometry. The very concept of Gaussian curvature, born from Gauss's geodesic surveys of Hanover, became the mathematical skeleton of Einstein's universe. Every equation that describes the bending of space-time around a star, every calculation of black holes and gravitational waves, carries Gauss's DNA. Thus, the boy from Brunswick who once amazed a classroom teacher indirectly gave physicists the ability to imagine the cosmos itself. In computing, Gauss's presence is equally profound. The Gaussian distribution underlies machine learning, error correction, and statistical inference. Whenever an algorithm identifies faces in a photograph, predicts weather patterns, or translates languages, it uses principles that trace back to Gauss's method of least squares and probability analysis. The digital world thrives on extracting patterns from noise, exactly the problem Gauss solved 2 centuries earlier when he sought to determine the orbit of Ceres from scattered observations. In a sense, Gauss is the silent architect of artificial intelligence, not because he designed computers, but because he gave them the mathematical grammar to learn. Modern finance, too, bends under his influence. Risk analysis, stock predictions, and economic models rely on Gaussian assumptions, sometimes to their peril. The bell curve became not only a statistical tool, but also a cultural metaphor for normality itself. And when financial crises revealed the limitations of assuming that all randomness follows Gaussian laws, scholars pointed out that it was never Gauss who erred, but those who worshipped his methods without questioning their scope. Even on critique, Gauss remained central. Yet, as Gauss's intellectual reach stretches into modernity, the haunting questions of his private life follow him into this future. How do we reconcile a man who helped humanity see the stars, map the earth, and structure knowledge itself with the man who could not always show warmth to his children? In a world increasingly fascinated by the personal lives of geniuses, from Einstein's turbulent marriages to Turing's tragic persecution, Gauss too is re-examined. His story becomes not only one of equations, but of costs. Perhaps the irony is this: the same perfectionism that makes modern AI possible, the same pursuit of clarity that allowed Einstein to imagine curved space-time, was the same perfectionism that closed Gauss's heart. He wanted absolute certainty, but human beings are not equations. His children, unlike planetary orbits, could not be predicted or controlled. His wives, unlike geometric theorems, could not be made flawless. His refusal to embrace imperfection in mathematics bled into his life, leaving those closest to him longing for a tenderness that rarely came. And yet, the world forgives him, or at least overlooks him for this, because his gifts are so immense. We live in a world shaped by Gauss at every turn. In the navigation systems of airplanes, in the GPS of smartphones, in the curves of relativity that guide satellites, in the algorithms of artificial intelligence that recommend what to watch or which medical treatments to pursue. Gauss is there in every quiet calculation that holds modern civilization together. So the paradox sharpens. Can a man whose mind feeds billions still be called irresponsible in the narrow walls of his home? Is genius judged by the scale of its gift to humanity, or by the silence it leaves in the rooms where love was expected? With Gauss, the answer is never simple. The modern world thrives because of him, but the story of his life whispers that genius never comes free. When history gathers its greatest minds into a single hall, the imagined pantheon of human progress, Gauss is always among them. He stands beside Newton, who unveiled the laws of motion, Einstein, who reimagined the cosmos, Turing, who gave birth to computing, Curie, who unlocked radioactivity. Yet Gauss occupies a distinct throne. While others are remembered for singular revolutions, Gauss is remembered for many. Number theory, statistics, geometry, astronomy, geodesy, electromagnetism, each field bears his mark, as if no domain could resist the gravitational pull of his intellect. To speak of science without Gauss is to speak of architecture without foundations. But greatness invites comparison, and comparison invites judgment. Newton, for all his genius, was notorious for his vanity and feuds. Einstein, beloved for his wit, struggled in his marriages and often disappointed his children. Turing, brilliant and tragic, suffered persecution that stained society more than himself. Gauss's life, by contrast, seems quieter on the surface. No great feuds, no scandals of betrayal, no dramatic downfall. And yet, in this quietness lies the paradox. Gauss failed not by storm but by silence. His neglect was not violent but subtle, not dramatic but lingering. The absence of warmth, the quick remarriage after Johanna's death, the alienation of his children, these are the shadows that trail him. This dual image prince and absentee has made Gauss a powerful symbol. On one hand, he embodies the heights of intellect, proof that a single mind can illuminate vast territories of knowledge. On the other hand, he embodies the warning that brilliance alone does not complete a life. His story asks, what is the measure of a man? Theorems that last centuries, or the unspoken words at a family dinner table? For society, Gauss thus serves two roles at once. In education, he is the hero of elegance and clarity, the boy genius who saw patterns instantly, the master who taught that mathematics is not drudgery but vision. In philosophy, he is the cautionary tale, the reminder that obsession with perfection can harden the heart. This combination is what keeps his name alive, not merely as an academic reference, but as a cultural archetype. He is revered and questioned, celebrated and dissected. The 20th and 21st centuries elevated Gauss further by linking him to revolutions he never lived to see. Without his mathematics, relativity would have lacked its scaffolding, computer science would have lacked its probabilistic skeleton, artificial intelligence would have lacked its statistical backbone. Gauss becomes the invisible partner of modernity, present at every breakthrough, though long dead. The bell curve on a scientist's graph, the curvature in an astrophysicist's equation, the error correction in a coder's algorithm, all of these are quiet tributes to him. And yet no monument, no stamp, no banknote erases the private man. Scholars who look closely still find the unhealed wound of Johanna's death, the hurried second marriage, the children who fled to America, the daughter who gave her life to his care. These details matter because they force us to confront the whole picture. Genius is not divorced from humanity. The brilliance of Gauss's mind did not exempt him from the responsibilities of love, nor did it absolve him of his failures. If anything, his story reveals the cost of imbalance. When one gives everything to the eternal, the immediate can be neglected. Thus, Gauss stands in the pantheon both as inspiration and as warning. He shows what the mind can achieve when freed from compromise, and he shows what the heart can lose when imprisoned by perfection. To admire him is to admire the architecture of modern science. To reflect on him is to reflect on the fragility of human bonds. He is a giant among giants, but also a reminder that even giants cast shadows. In this way, Gauss continues to matter not just to mathematicians, but to anyone who wrestles with the question of what it means to live a full life. His name is carved into the structures of knowledge, but his story is carved into the deeper narrative of humanity. That brilliance without warmth can change the world but may not comfort a child. That immortality in science does not guarantee intimacy in life. Long after Gauss's body was laid to rest in Göttingen, his name refused to fade. Nations, universities, and scientific institutions reached for him as a symbol, enshrining him in stone, in bronze, in textbooks, and even in currency. To Germany, he became a crown jewel of national pride, the mathematical counterpart to Goethe in literature or Beethoven in music. To the wider world, he became the embodiment of pure intellect, a man whose thought seemed untainted by politics or vanity. And yet, even as monuments rose, so too did the whispers of his private life, reminders that behind every statue is a human being. In Brunswick, his birthplace, a grand statue was erected in 1880, showing Gauss as the sovereign of numbers, draped in classical robes, his gaze lifted toward eternal truths. The city of Göttingen, where he spent most of his life, likewise honored him with monuments and memorials. His portrait appeared on German postage stamps and banknotes. The 10-mark note, bearing his image circulated widely, meaning that millions of Germans carried Gauss in their wallets daily. This was not just commemoration, it was canonization. Gauss was no longer only a mathematician, he was a national icon, a reminder that Germany had given the world one of its greatest scientific minds. Universities followed suit. Institutes of mathematics and physics bore his name. Textbooks dedicated entire sections to his theorems, and every generation of students encountered him not once but many times. To study mathematics without meeting Gauss was impossible, like studying literature without Shakespeare. In this sense, education itself became a monument to Gauss, perpetually renewing his relevance. Yet while nations and institutions built monuments, biographers and historians chipped away at the myth to reveal the man. They wrote of Johanna, the beloved first wife lost in childbirth, and the almost shocking speed with which Gauss remarried Minna. They wrote of his children, some alienated, some emigrated, some bound to him in lifelong duty. They described a household dominated by silence, a father whose intellectual gravity crushed as much as it inspired. This counter-narrative complicated the statues. It forced admirers to reconcile the prince of mathematicians with the man who, in some ways, had failed as husband and father. The tension remains unresolved because it mirrors a larger truth about how society remembers its geniuses. Nations prefer monuments that simplify. Gauss the genius, Gauss the immortal. Historians, however, prefer nuance. Gauss the flawed, Gauss the human. Between the two emerges a more complete picture, one that neither glorification nor condemnation alone can capture. This dual remembrance also gives Gauss enduring cultural power. He is not a relic of the past, but a mirror for the present. Every era reinvents him according to its needs. The 19th century celebrated him as the sober, meticulous scholar, proof of German intellectual supremacy. The 20th century embraced him as a universal genius, his methods woven into relativity, statistics, and computing. The 21st century, more skeptical and more concerned with the human side of science, looks at him with ambivalence, admiring his genius while questioning his silence at home. And so Gauss occupies a peculiar place in collective memory. He is at once untouchable and vulnerable, monumental and human. His name appears on institutes and coins, his theorems and equations and algorithms, but his story also lingers in biographies that remind us of his grief, his coldness, his contradictions. To study Gauss is to study not just a mathematician, but the way societies create myths, how they exalt brilliance, how they excuse flaws, and how they wrestle with the paradox of greatness. In the end, every monument to Gauss is a paradox in stone. It celebrates a man who revealed eternal truths, but it cannot erase the questions of those who lived in his shadow. It immortalizes genius, but cannot silence the debate. Was he the prince of mathematicians, or was he an irresponsible husband? Perhaps he was both, and perhaps it is this very duality that keeps his memory alive not as a flat portrait, but as a living, unresolved conversation across centuries. To understand Gauss fully, one must step into the private chambers of his mind. The external story, his theorems, his discoveries, his observatory, shows what he accomplished. But the internal story, his habits, his perfectionism, his silences, explains why he lived as he did, both as the prince of mathematicians and perhaps as the irresponsible husband. Gauss's psychology was as formidable as his mathematics, precise, demanding, unyielding, and at times merciless. From the beginning, Gauss revealed a distaste for imperfection. His boyhood solution to the problem of summing numbers from 1 to 100 was not simply clever, it was elegant. Where others would labor through 100 additions, Gauss leapt straight to a formula. This was not just about speed, but about clarity, about cutting through mess to reveal structure. His mind recoiled from error, from untidiness, from anything less than crystalline precision. This instinct followed him all his life. It is why he published so little. Gauss filled notebooks with discoveries, some of which only came to light after his death. Among them were early insights into non-Euclidean geometry, number theory advancements, and methods later rediscovered by others. Why keep them hidden? Because Gauss could not bear to release anything he considered incomplete. He feared criticism, yes, but more deeply, he feared imperfection. For Gauss, a flawed theorem was not a step toward truth. It was an insult to truth. He chose silence over compromise. This silence extended into his relationships. When Johanna died, Gauss collapsed into grief, yet he rarely voiced it. His stoic face concealed emotions that thundered within. In private letters, a glimpse of tenderness appears, but in daily life he was reserved. His children rarely saw open affection. They saw a father who demanded excellence, who scolded error, who expected the same rigor from them that he demanded from himself. His second marriage to Minna was marked less by passion than by duty, perhaps because Gauss feared the vulnerability of love after Johanna's death. In his quest for certainty, he withdrew into the only realm where certainty seemed possible, mathematics. Perfectionism also made Gauss an intimidating mentor. Students approached him with ideas, hoping for encouragement. Instead, many received cold dismissal. Unless their work reached his high standard, Gauss offered little praise. Some left Göttingen disheartened, unable to thrive under his shadow. Yet others, tougher or luckier, carried his influence forward, transmitting Gauss's methods even when his words were few. His silence became a paradoxical form of teaching. Students learned not from what he said, but from the rigor of what he withheld. Psychologists today might describe Gauss as a man driven by obsessive precision, his identity fused with the pursuit of flawless truth. His strengths, clarity, rigor, vision were inseparable from his weaknesses, distance, coldness, silence. The same traits that gave the world the Gaussian distribution also created a household of unmet needs. The same perfection that made him immortal in science made him imperfect in intimacy. And grief, once etched into his soul, never left him. The death of Johanna did not just wound Gauss, it calcified him. He became more guarded, more silent, more unwilling to risk emotional exposure. To his children, this looked like neglect. To historians, it looks like a defense mechanism. To Gauss, perhaps, it was survival. He built walls around his heart even as he built bridges of knowledge for humanity. Thus, Gauss's psychology was not a footnote, but the engine of his paradox. He was not simply brilliant and cold by coincidence. His brilliance made his coldness, and his coldness sharpened his brilliance. To understand Gauss is to see that genius and flaw were not two separate forces in him, but one and the same. The relentless pursuit of perfection that elevated him beyond his peers and at the same time isolated him from those who loved him. This is why the question, Prince of Mathematicians or irresponsible husband, remains unanswerable. He was both, because he could not have been one without being the other. The very mind that gave us Gaussian curvature also gave us a man who demanded such precision in life that love, messy and imperfect, slipped through his grasp. To understand Gauss not only as an individual, but as a figure in the Republic of Science, we must look at how he stood among his contemporaries. For Gauss was not a solitary figure locked in a tower of genius. He was part of a world teeming with mathematicians, astronomers, physicists, and surveyors, all of whom felt the gravitational pull of his presence. Some found in him a partner, others a rival, many a critic, and a few a silent shadow haunting their discoveries. His relationships reveal not only his brilliance, but also his contradictions: secretive, cautious, fiercely critical, yet occasionally generous and collaborative. Perhaps the most famous rivalries of Gauss were not direct battles, but quiet dramas of omission. By the early 19th century, two mathematicians, Nikolai Lobachevsky in Russia and János Bolyai in Hungary, were developing what would later be called non-Euclidean geometry. The radical idea that Euclid's fifth postulate, the parallel postulate, did not hold universally. To most of the mathematical world, this was unthinkable, even heretical. But Gauss had already explored the same ideas in secret. His notebooks show that he had long suspected the possibility of curved geometries, and yet Gauss never published. When Bolyai sent his father's friend Farkas Bolyai a manuscript in 1832 containing the young man's revolutionary geometry, Gauss replied in words that have echoed controversially through history. To praise it would mean to praise myself, for the entire content of the work is already in my own meditations for 30 or 35 years. This statement crushed János Bolyai, who had hoped for recognition. To many, Gauss's response seemed arrogant, even cruel, a way of diminishing Bolyai's originality by claiming prior discovery without proof. With Lobachevsky, too, Gauss acknowledged the correctness of the Russian's work privately, but gave little public endorsement. He admired Lobachevsky's courage, yet his perfectionism and fear of controversy kept him silent. As a result, Lobachevsky and Bolyai earned the fame of publishing non-Euclidean geometry, while Gauss remained the ghostly figure who might have claimed the title but did not. This episode shows both Gauss's integrity and his flaw. He would not risk imperfection, but his silence bruised those who dared where he did not. Not all of Gauss's relationships were marked by rivalry. His friendship and collaboration with Wilhelm Weber, a younger physicist, brought out his more generous side. Together in Göttingen during the 1,830 seconds, the two men laid the groundwork for modern electromagnetism. They developed instruments, formulated laws, and even built an early electromagnetic telegraph, the first of its kind in Germany. Gauss respected Weber's energy and creativity, while Weber revered Gauss's authority and precision. Theirs was a partnership of balance. Weber supplied experimental drive, Gauss supplied mathematical clarity. Their joint publications on magnetism remain milestones in physics. For Gauss, who was often solitary, this collaboration proved that he could, under the right circumstances, share brilliance. It also showed the scientific community that Gauss, despite his aloofness, could be a builder of networks, not just a solitary star. In astronomy, Gauss commanded near universal respect. His successful prediction of Ceres's orbit in 1801 had made him a household name among astronomers. From that point onward, his methods became standard. Astronomers across Europe consulted him for advice, and his critiques could make or break reputations. He was not always kind. His letters sometimes dismissed others' work with icy brevity, but his authority was unchallengeable. To disagree with Gauss was to risk professional embarrassment. In this sense, his perfectionism created what historians call the Gauss effect. He elevated standards to such heights that contemporaries measured themselves against him, often finding themselves lacking. As director of the Göttingen Observatory, Gauss oversaw students and assistants who longed for his mentorship. Some found in him a stern but inspiring guide. Others felt crushed by his criticism. He rarely praised, often scolded, and sometimes refused to acknowledge even excellent work if it did not meet his exacting standards. Yet his influence was profound. Students who endured his rigor carried the Gaussian standard into their own careers, transmitting his methods across Europe. His teaching style was less about instruction than about intimidation and inspiration, a paradoxical mixture that produced both resentment and excellence. In sum, Gauss's relationships with contemporaries show the same duality as his family life. He could be supportive as with Weber, or dismissive, as with Bolyai. He could be the authority who advanced astronomy, or the critic who discouraged students. His perfectionism, secrecy, and cautious nature shaped his reputation. He was both admired and feared, respected and resented. He was the center of scientific gravity, yet often alone. Thus, Gauss's place in the scientific community was defined as much by his personality as by his genius. His silence on non-Euclidean geometry left others to claim discoveries that might have been his. His collaboration with Weber demonstrated the heights possible when he chose partnership. His students, though sometimes disheartened, carried his influence far and wide. In every case, the man shaped the community not only through his equations, but through the formidable force of his character. When we place Gauss alongside other titans of science, patterns begin to emerge. Genius, it seems, often carries solitude as its shadow. Newton, Pascal, Einstein, these figures shared with Gauss not only intellectual brilliance, but also complex, sometimes painful, personal lives. And yet, in each case, the balance between greatness and humanity manifested differently. By comparing Gauss with these solitary geniuses, we see more clearly what made him unique and what made him familiar. Isaac Newton, like Gauss, was a figure of immense rigor and secrecy. He, too, withheld discoveries for fear of imperfection or criticism. His calculus lay unpublished for years. His rivalries with Leibniz and Hooke revealed a man as combative as he was brilliant. Newton's aloofness was legendary, his personal attachments sparse. Compared to Newton, Gauss seems less combative, but equally cautious. Where Newton battled his rivals publicly, Gauss often avoided battle by retreating into silence. Both men, however, left a legacy of intimidation. Contemporaries admired them, but often feared their judgment. Newton's feuds were louder. Gauss's silences were quieter, but no less formidable. Blaise Pascal, the French mathematician and philosopher, burned with intensity in both intellect and faith. Unlike Gauss, Pascal left behind passionate writings, his Pensées, that revealed the turmoil of his inner life. Pascal embraced imperfection in words, showing vulnerability alongside brilliance. Gauss, by contrast, concealed his emotions, leaving few glimpses of his private struggles. Yet both men shared the weight of early genius, child prodigies who astonished teachers and reshaped mathematics before adulthood. Pascal's fragility, his poor health, and early death contrast with Gauss's longevity, but both lived lives haunted by questions of meaning beyond numbers. Pascal sought solace in religion, Gauss sought it in the perfection of mathematics. Albert Einstein, centuries later, was hailed not only for relativity, but also for his charm, humor, and public persona. Unlike Gauss, Einstein embraced visibility. He gave interviews, wrote popular essays, spoke about peace and politics. Yet his personal life bore its own scars: troubled marriages, strained relationships with children, a daughter whose fate remains shrouded in mystery. In Einstein, we see a man whose warmth to the world contrasted with difficulties at home. In Gauss, we see the opposite: a man cold to the world, reserved in public, and equally distant at home. Both remind us that genius often carries private costs, though the form of those costs differs. Taken together, these comparisons highlight a recurring archetype, the solitary genius. Whether through secrecy, Newton, fragility, Pascal, charisma masking turmoil, Einstein, or cold rigor, Gauss, these figures lived at a distance from ordinary intimacy. Their gifts elevated them above their peers, but elevation came with isolation. For Gauss, the isolation was not of drama, but of silence. He did not feud like Newton, nor write confessions like Pascal, nor charm the masses like Einstein. He simply withdrew, wrapping himself in perfection, leaving behind equations, but few words of warmth. What makes Gauss unique among these giants is his breadth. Newton reshaped physics, Pascal blended mathematics and theology, Einstein revolutionized space and time, but Gauss did all of these in fragments. He gave geometry the seeds of relativity, statistics the foundation of probability, physics the laws of electromagnetism, astronomy the method to predict orbits. His genius was not a single thunderclap, but a storm across multiple horizons. And yet, despite this breadth, his personal life remained narrowly defined, marked by silence, grief, and distance. This contrast deepens the paradox. The man whose intellect reached wider than almost anyone's in history could not reach fully across his own dinner table. Among the solitary geniuses of history, Gauss stands as both typical and singular. Typical in his personal isolation, singular in the sheer magnitude of his contributions. Carl Friedrich Gauss does not belong only to the 18th and 19th centuries, he belongs to the entire story of humanity's progress. His life, works, and contradictions form a symbol, a lens through which we can explore not just numbers and equations, but also what it means for humankind to pursue knowledge relentlessly. Gauss is more than a mathematician. He is a parable of modern civilization. At the most obvious level, Gauss represents the triumph of rational thought. He took the messy, intuitive playground of number theory and forged it into a disciplined science. He transformed astronomy into a precise, predictive tool. He turned geodesy into an exact science of Earth's shape, bridging the gap between theory and landscape. He gave probability and statistics a foundation so solid that the digital age now rests upon it. In every step, Gauss symbolizes the Enlightenment ideal, that reason, rigor, and calculation can illuminate the world. To invoke Gauss is to invoke the belief that the human mind can grasp reality through logic and mathematics. Culturally, Gauss has become an icon, his face on currency, his statues in cities, his name etched into institutes. These are not merely honors, but signals of what society values. Gauss represents intellect as a form of power, a kind of invisible sovereignty. Unlike kings or generals, his dominion was not over land, but over truth itself. In this way, Gauss became the model of the pure scholar, the scientist who embodies the heights of thought, untainted by politics. Nations and universities alike point to him as evidence of human greatness, as if to say, here is proof of what humanity can achieve when intellect reigns. But no symbol is pure. Alongside the triumph lies the shadow. Gauss's personal life forces us to confront the price of genius. Was his silence at home the inevitable byproduct of his brilliance? Or was it a failure of balance, a choice to value numbers over people? Philosophically, his story raises the ancient question: is it better to live for the eternal or the immediate? Gauss chose the eternal. His theorems will outlive empires, but in doing so, he sometimes neglected the fragile immediacies of love and family. This duality makes Gauss a timeless symbol, not only of progress, but of warning. He embodies the paradox that progress often comes with sacrifice, and that the benefits to humanity may be paid for by the sorrows of those closest to the genius. Seen this way, Gauss is not just a German mathematician, but a chapter in the human narrative of striving and imperfection. His life reminds us that progress is not a smooth curve, but a jagged line. For every theorem proved, a silence at the dinner table. For every orbit predicted, a child who feels unseen. Humanity advances, but always at a cost. And yet, we continue to celebrate Gauss because his contributions made the modern world possible. GPS satellites, AI algorithms, gravitational physics all whisper his name. To deny him his place would be dishonest, but to ignore the cost would be equally dishonest. In Gauss, humanity sees itself, brilliant, flawed, reaching for eternity, but stumbling in intimacy. In the 21st century, Gauss's story feels more relevant than ever. As society grapples with the consequences of rapid technological progress, artificial intelligence, space exploration, quantum computing, we face the same question Gauss's life asks: can we embrace progress without losing humanity? Gauss symbolizes both the hope and the risk. He shows us the heights intellect can achieve, and he warns us of the shadows intellect can cast. Thus, Gauss is not simply remembered, he is interpreted. He is not only a mathematician, but a cultural myth, a philosophical question, a mirror. To see Gauss clearly is to see both the power of human reason and the fragility of human bonds. He remains eternally a symbol of progress and eternally a reminder of its price. More than 2 centuries after his birth, Carl Friedrich Gauss has not faded into the dry pages of textbooks. Instead, he has crossed into the realm of imagination, literature, art, and culture, where his name carries a weight far beyond equations. He has become a symbol, a shorthand for genius itself, often invoked by novelists, playwrights, and filmmakers as the embodiment of human intellect. And yet, even here, the tension between reverence and critique remains. Writers have long been fascinated by Gauss. In novels, he often appears as a background figure whose brilliance serves as contrast to ordinary human struggles. Perhaps the most famous literary portrayal comes from Daniel Kehlmann's novel Measuring the World, 2005, which fictionalizes Gauss's life alongside Alexander von Humboldt. Kehlmann's Gauss is a genius trapped in a world too small for his mind, often irritable, often cold, yet undeniably brilliant. The novel portrays his difficult relationships, his grief over Johanna, and his impatience with anything that distracted him from mathematics. It cemented the image of Gauss not only as a scientific titan, but as a man whose brilliance was inseparable from his human flaws. Beyond Kehlmann, Gauss appears in essays and poems that use his name as metaphor. To think like Gauss has become literary shorthand for clarity, rigor, and vision. Poets invoke him as the archetype of intellect, a man who mapped infinity itself. Novelists use him as a symbol of the lonely genius, the figure who sees the world differently but pays the price in isolation. In visual art, Gauss's likeness has been reproduced countless times. Statues in Brunswick and Göttingen, portraits in galleries, sketches in textbooks. But beyond literal depictions, artists often use Gauss as a motif. Abstract painters have used the bell curve, the Gaussian distribution, as a visual symbol of order hidden within chaos. Sculptors have carved mathematical curves inspired by his theorems. Even digital artists incorporate Gauss into modern aesthetics, creating visualizations of Gaussian functions as art. Through these reinterpretations, Gauss has become an icon of form, structure, and order, the mathematician as artist, whose canvas was the universe itself. Even outside academia and high art, Gauss's name circulates in popular culture. Science fiction writers reference him as the measure of human genius. In films and television, when characters need to evoke mathematical brilliance, Gauss's name often surfaces. The Gaussian blur in digital image processing, used in photography and computer graphics, has introduced his name to millions of people who may never have studied mathematics deeply. Gamers, designers, coders all encounter Gauss, sometimes without realizing the 19th century genius behind the function. In classrooms, the story of the boy who summed numbers from 1 to 100 continues to inspire. Teachers retell it not just as math history but as folklore, almost like a parable about vision and insight. This story alone has made Gauss an enduring figure in the imagination of children across the globe, a cultural myth as much as a mathematical fact. But popular culture has also embraced the contradictions. In novels like Measuring the World, Gauss is not romanticized but humanized, brilliant yet gruff, visionary yet difficult, a man who astonished the world but left wounds at home. This duality resonates with modern audiences who are suspicious of one-dimensional heroes. In Gauss, they find a genius who is both admirable and problematic, a figure who reflects our ambivalence about greatness itself. Part of what makes Gauss so enduring in culture is that he straddles the line between the mythic and the real. He is mythic in his achievements, theorems that seem eternal, methods that still shape the present, but he is real in his flaws: grief, silence, impatience, distance. This combination makes him feel alive, even after 2 centuries. He is not a sterile bust in a museum, but a character in the human story, endlessly interpreted, endlessly reimagined. Thus, Gauss remains not just a figure of science, but a cultural legend. He exists in equations and algorithms, in novels and statues, in classrooms and computer screens. He is remembered not only for what he discovered, but for what he symbolizes: the paradox of human brilliance, the light and the shadow of genius. Carl Friedrich Gauss remains one of history's most luminous figures, a man whose mind spanned from the elegance of number theory to the vastness of the cosmos. He gave the world the Gaussian distribution, the laws of magnetism, the curvature that underpins relativity, and the methods that still guide science today. His legacy is woven into every equation of modern physics, every algorithm of artificial intelligence, every map and measurement of our planet. In this sense, Gauss is eternal. He is the prince of mathematicians, a sovereign whose reign endures across centuries. And yet, behind the monuments and the theorems, there was a man who loved and lost Johanna, who remarried with startling speed, who demanded perfection even from his children, and who often met the messy needs of family life with silence instead of tenderness. To some, this makes him an irresponsible husband, a distant father, a man consumed by intellect at the expense of intimacy. To others, it makes him simply human, wounded by grief, trapped by perfectionism, and unable to reconcile the infinite clarity of mathematics with the infinite complexity of love. So what finally was Gauss? The truth is that he was both. He was the prince and the absentee, the genius and the flawed man. His life teaches us that brilliance does not erase humanity, nor does humanity erase brilliance. The light of his genius illuminated the path of science, but the shadows it cast remind us of the cost. In the end, Gauss belongs not only to mathematicians, but to all of us, as a symbol of the paradox of genius, that the same fire which lights the stars of knowledge can also burn the bonds of home. He remains forever a question. Do we remember him as the prince of mathematicians, or as an irresponsible husband? Perhaps the most honest answer is that we remember him as both a man whose greatness was undeniable and whose humanity was, like all of ours, imperfect.